What's up, guys? So we got a bit of a different setup today. Currently in here at my desk is where all of my game stuff is set up because the game room's still under construction. It's gonna be for a little while because I have things I want to do in there that require me to build things, and that requires money. So the game room will be done when it'll be done. That will be our permanent recording setup when we're done. So until then, y'all will just have to please excuse the constant change of scenery because that's got to get done before we can do stuff. I hope this video doesn't turn out to be too ramble heavy because I don't script things. I like to talk from the heart, and sometimes that requires repeating myself. Sometimes that requires rambling on. Sometimes that requires spouting nonsense and taking it back. So please excuse if any of that happens. I'm trying to be as authentic for these videos and for you guys as I can be. So I know I've talked about my love of Zelda in the past, but a game series that I've not really discussed very much that I also really enjoy is Metroid. So I first played Super Metroid in 2017. And while that wasn't my first experience with Metroid, that was the Metroid game that made it click. I had heard good things about the Metroid series and I wanted to experience it from the beginning. So I went and bought the original Metroid on my Wii Virtual Console, and I did not care for it at the time, so I never really bothered to explore the rest of the series. Well, in late 2016, I think, I had my 3DS, and I bought Super Metroid on the 3DS Virtual Console, and it just clicked. I loved it. Since then, I've been exploring the series a little bit more. I still haven't gone and played the original Metroid again, but I've played Metroid 2, I've played Fusion, I've played Samus Returns on the 3DS, I played Dread and loved it, I've played Zero Mission, I've played all the 2D Metroid games, but I never went and played Prime. Well, I finally did. I finally found the GameCube version of it for a decent price. I played through it and I want to talk about it. Be warned, this video, I'm going to talk pretty heavily about Metroid Prime, including the gameplay, the story, the mechanics, all these little things that if you've not played the game before and care about, then you might not want to watch this video. Go play the game for yourself, then come back here and you can continue and we can talk about it. I finished the game last night and it's still pretty heavy in my mind, and I want to get this recording done while it's still in my head, and so while I can still talk about it and properly discuss it. So first up, let's talk about what is Metroid Prime. For anyone who doesn't know, which would be like 3 of you, Metroid Prime is the first 3D Metroid game that was released for the GameCube back in 2002. This released same day as Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy, which is the proper Metroid 4. Because Nintendo's lead team on Metroid was focused on creating Fusion, they handed Prime off to Retro Studios to develop. There was some concerns with that when it happened because 1, Metroid had never been in 3D before, and 2, you were handing it off to a studio who had never developed a Metroid game before. So there was a lot of concern about whether or not they were actually going to be able to do a good job. And for all intents and purposes, they delivered in spades. Much how Super Mario 64 and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time felt like natural transitions of their series into 3D, Metroid Prime does a really good job of that as well. All the little core aspects that I was expecting from a Metroidvania are here in this game. So I know this is 22 years too late, but good on you, Retro. You did a very good job of bringing Metroid to the 3rd dimension and keeping that same feel and vibe that you would get from Metroid. Let's talk a little bit about the controls. The GameCube has 2 sticks. It has your left analog stick and your C stick. I knew it wasn't going to be, but my brain went into this expecting a twin stick kind of game where you have your left stick is to move around and strafe about and avoid things, and your right stick is to control your camera and where you're aiming. Metroid Prime doesn't do that. This game came out in 2002, and you were coming off the back of something like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, where you had one thing for movement, and that was just the one stick. Your movement is forward, back is back, and left and right are turn. This game uses tank controls. And while I'm not a fan of tank controls in the slightest, Metroid Prime does do it very well because it's not a slow turn like you get with something like Tomb Raider. Unlike Lara Croft, Samus actually does turn very quickly so where you can keep your eyes on the action at all times. And one thing I really want to commend just Retro Studios on doing, but just the Metroid series as a whole, really, is that Metroid games have always done a very good job of utilizing every aspect of the controller. Metroid 2 had a lot of different options. Super Metroid had a lot of different things you could do with controllers that were incredibly limited. And future Metroid games have gone on to do that as well. Like, oh my god, Samus Returns on the 3DS pushes the controls of that system to, I think, as far as you actually can. That's very impressive, and it's something that I've always appreciated about Metroid games. The GameCube controller has 2 analog sticks and 12 buttons, and none of them feel like they're wasted. It's not like Ocarina of Time where the L button only turns the map on and off. No button on this controller feels wasted in Metroid Prime, and that's something that I really appreciate. Similarly to other Metroid games, you get a number of different visors and beams that you can use as you progress through the world, to see different things and do different types of damage to different enemies and objects. But unlike older Metroid games and some future Metroid games where when you get a new beam or a new thing, it just kind of becomes the base of what you're able to do, in this you actually have to swap between them, and that is what the D-pad and the C-stick are for. On the HUD, on the bottom left, you have these different visors, and you can swap between them using the D-pad. And on the right, you have the different beam types, which you can swap between at the flick of a finger with the C-stick. And stuff like that allows for a lot of action in the gameplay because you can have multiple enemies coming at you, all who take a different beam type, and you can quickly shift back and forth to damaging each different type. It makes some of the battles really hectic, rather stressful, and really fun. Speaking of the combat, I want to just talk a little bit about that. Combat seems pretty standard as far as just like your general moving about the world, just all the little mooks running about that you need to take care of as you're trying to progress. I mentioned before, you have your different beam types. Some enemies require a specific beam to actually do damage to them. It's a pretty standard fare. Where combat gets interesting though is with the bosses, because your combat almost becomes like a puzzle, and you have to figure out specific ways that the bosses can be damaged before you can actually start hammering on them. Because of that, your first run against a boss is going to actually be rather difficult because you have no idea what to do. You're taking so much damage trying to figure out how to deal damage. But a lot of the times, once you figure out how to deal the damage, the bosses tend to be kind of easy because you're just looking for a weakness that you can exploit and then exploiting the hell out of it. The bosses are pretty varied, so that's good. They do take some doing to figure out how to actually damage, at least a couple of them, the later ones at least. But then once you kind of have a feel for what to do, they're not that hard. They aren't that hard. Even if they're not hard, though, that doesn't stop them from being fun, which they are. So, good and a bad there. I don't remember their names, but some of the more standout fights to me were the big old rock monster when you're trying to get the ice beam, I believe, and the Meta Ridley fight was also really fun. I really enjoyed it. Going back to what I was talking about before with how Retro did a really good job of bringing the Metroid feel into 3D, is how they told the story. In true Metroid fare, there wasn't a lot of story, but what story was there was presented rather well. They did change it up a little bit because prior to this in older Metroids, very little was explained to you. Like, you were kind of just hucked into the world and left to kind of piece together the story by what's happening in the environment, what's actually happening to your characters. There was very little, and in some cases no, dialogue to actually tell you what was happening. And while they never outright told you stuff that was going on, like how some of the later games get a little heavy in the storytelling because they really rip you out of the action to explain what's going on, especially Fusion, this game does still have a lot of options for you to read some lore and explanations that are coming out, but by means of one of the visors that they give you, the scan visor. We'll talk a little bit about one of the things I don't care for about the scan visor later, but for now, they give you the scan visor so you can look at specific things in the environment and get information about it, whether that be enemies or certain interactable things, or sort of telling you which power-up you're going to need to interact with a specific piece of the environment, which is good because it gives you a means to inspect the world a little bit and maybe be able to see something that's not quite standing out to the naked eye, which is good because in 2D Metroids they can make something look a little weird, but in a 3D game that's a lot harder to do. One, you have all these models, so it might just be a weird artifact in the model, but also because it's a 3D space and you have to look up, down, left, right, and sideways, you just straight up might not see something. So giving you the ability to look around the environment with basically a different set of eyes to point out things that might be interactable to you is a very nice touch. It's a very good thing to have in case you start getting a little stuck, like I did a couple of times, especially early game when I had just gotten the scan visor and I forgot that it was even a thing. But circling back, the scan visor is used to give you a lot of the lore of what's happened in the game. And so for those who don't know, the Metroid Prime, well, the Prime trilogy actually is set between the events of the original Metroid and Metroid 2. I don't want to spoil the story for you so you can experience it for yourself. Just know that the game doesn't like really outright tell you what's been going on, but it does give you options to read a lot about it, so long as you're thorough in looking around and finding what's actually been going on the planet. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the negatives that I had with the game, and keep in mind that some of these negatives also have some positive to them, so like it's kind of a mixed bag. I know one of the big problems people had with the game was actually the Chozo artifact hunt. They're right at the end of the game. Spoiler here, to enter the final area of the game, you have to go around the world and find these what are known as Chozo artifacts, which are basically act as the keys to a seal that they put over the source of the phazon that has infected the planet. The game does give you hints as to where these artifacts can be found, but to get those hints requires you to go to a very specific room in the early parts of the game. And if for whatever reason you don't go there, you'll be playing through the entire game without those hints to give you an idea of where to look for them. Now the game does have some Chozo lore that you can scan throughout the game that hints at the artifacts and like lets you know that they exist. But again, if you don't find the artifact temple, then you won't know where to even begin looking for them. I personally didn't find the artifact hunt to be too bad because one, I actually did know about that going into the game. I follow Game Maker's Toolkit and he did a dive into the world design of Metroid Prime. So I knew he did that years ago. And I watched it when it came out years ago, but I haven't really watched it since. So I was going into this kind of blind, but I did know some of the things to expect from it, you know? And that was one of them. So I knew that was coming. I just didn't know how to find any of the artifacts. And the hint system that they gave was actually very thorough. I'm not going to be able to show it for you guys because I have already found them all and it doesn't show you the hints again once you find them. And it will give you the area that it's in, like Phendrana or Magmore, and then it will give you some clue as to the room you need to be in. There was one in the Phazon mines that said a certain research room in the mines. You go down to the Phazon mines and you look at the room titles. There are two places that are labeled blank research. And so you know it's in one of those two rooms. So while it does require you to go and explore, basically lap the whole world again looking for them, it's still pretty direct in giving you instruction on where to go to actually get them. So again, while some people had complaints about it, and I can understand why you had complaints about it, I feel like they gave you enough tools that it wasn't that big a deal. But again, I can understand why if you missed the artifact room and you weren't scanning things to know that the artifacts were even there in the first place, if you get to the end game and then it's like, oh, you have to go on a 12-piece scavenger hunt throughout the entire world, I do see how that could have been a problem for some people. Another complaint I had was actually in how this game handles its percent completion. Other Metroid games or prior Metroid games, your percent completion was based exclusively on pickups. So many missile upgrades and power bomb upgrades and energy tanks and all these little collectibles throughout the world, and your percent completion is based off of those in other Metroid games. In Metroid Prime, while all of the upgrades and items you get are part of your completion, so is scanning everything in the game. And while I understand that that's something that completionists will want to do anyway, and that that's something that gives you the most information about everything that's going on in the game, I don't think scanning really should have counted towards 100% completion, because there are several enemies, namely the bosses, which you only get one shot at. And if you forget to do it, then your 100% run is toast. And I personally just don't like that. I don't 100% games, so it's not that big a deal to me, but I do 100% Metroid games, and I'm not gonna go 100% Metroid Prime because of that. One, I now can't 100% my file because I know early game there were several bosses that I didn't scan, but also I can't be bothered to do that. I'm 30 years old. I have a job. I have things to do. I cannot be bothered to turn on that scan visor every second of this game and look around for things that I didn't look at before. I just can't do that. And again, that's not inherently a complaint about the game. That's a complaint about the game from my personal perspective. In Metroid games specifically, I like going around and finding all of the collectibles and getting Samus as powerful as she can be, but I just don't have the time or the want to spend the time to go and look at every little thing in the world that I might not have looked at before, just to make sure I got 100% scan completion. Hell, just having the game up and while I'm recording this, I noticed something that I didn't scan in the first room of the game. And it wasn't even anything important. It was literally just a piece of information about Talon 4 that you could only get by looking at this one specific thing. So again, I understand why it was there. For me personally, I wish it wasn't. And this next one is such a minor nitpick, but it's just something that I noticed, and that's the enemy respawn. Now, I know in previous Metroids, as soon as you leave the room, the enemies in the room you just left will respawn, but that just doesn't feel quite right here. And also, some of the enemies in this game are a bit more annoying to fight than others. And so I understand how it works. Like, the enemies respawn once you get 2 rooms away, because that's when the first room unloads from the game, basically. It's like you'll start in a room and you move to the next room. This room is still loaded in the game, so if you were to backtrack and go back into this room, all the enemies are gone. But to go from this room into a different room, this room unloads and loads up another room. So now, if you go into this room and then come back through this room into the first room, all the enemies are back. And there were several points in the game where you had to do that. You'd go 2 rooms away and then come back, and then all the enemies were back and you'd have to fight them all again. I wish that there was just a bit more forgiveness with distance away from rooms before the game had to reload the enemies. And I understand that that's a limitation of the GameCube and not something that could have really been worked around. It's something that I wish was done differently to make the experience a bit more forgiving whenever you have to fight your way through a long line of rooms to get to something at the end of a hallway and then have to fight your way back to get out of those rooms, which made a couple of the Space Pirates bases more, I don't want to say challenging, but just annoying to get through than they had to be. If I had to make one proper complaint about the game, it's the one thing that I feel like Retro Studios kind of missed the mark on, was actually the ending of the game. Not only was the final boss was fun and hard, but literally every Metroid that I've played ends with some kind of escape sequence. Now, they did have one at the beginning of the game for the end of the intro, but the end game usually has this, oh god, you have 3 minutes to get away from what all's about to happen. And they started to do that, it looked like, but for whatever reason that became just a scripted scene instead of giving you control and praying that you can actually get away from the problem before it actually kills you. And that's the one thing about Metroid games that Retro just seemed to miss for some reason. I don't understand why that was left out, especially since it looked like they were going to do that. But honestly, if that's all I have to complain about, then I think they made a good game. I played my first Metroid game in 2017 when I played Super Metroid for the first time, and slowly I've been working my way through the series, and I've loved every experience I've had with it. Metroid has become one of my favorite game series over the years, and I always look forward to experiencing a new one. And Metroid Prime has been on my list to experience for a while, and I'm very glad I finally got the ability to. This apparently does some kind of linking up with Metroid Fusion. I have not done that. I might do it at some point, but for now I don't really see a need to. And I haven't looked up what it actually is, so how about down in the comments you guys tell me what does the linking up of Fusion to Metroid Prime actually do? I'd be curious to know. But I think that might be it for me. I've blethered on for over an hour at this point of my time. So we'll see how well I can cut this down and see what it becomes whenever I go to actually post it. What about you guys? Talk to me about Metroid Prime. Have you played it? If you have, what did you think of it? If you haven't played it and you want to, first off, why'd you even watch this video? But why haven't you gotten around to playing it yet? And if you haven't played it and don't intend to play it, why? What turns you off of the game? Just in the comments down below, talk to me about Metroid Prime. I want to hear other people's experiences and thoughts on the game. I really enjoyed it. You just heard my thoughts on it, so talk to me in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. But I think that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I look forward to talking more about games with you guys as the days go on. So again, thank you guys for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good one, y'all.